All right. So going to carry on from where we left off on the seven seals. So I don't know if you do remember, but we were talking about the Reformation. We've gone through quite a few sets of slides on the Reformation, and we're sort of getting to the end of it now, just the last couple of verses to finish off with. So you may remember, and you may not, that the last thing we talked about was in Revelation chapter 11, and talked about after 3 days and a half, prophetically speaking, which is 3.5 years, that the witnesses who had been testifying for the things of the Lord had been oppressed, and they had been put down by the beast system, and as a result of that, it seemed as though that the Catholic system in Europe had really crushed all opposition, and there was a lot of rejoicing over that. But then 3.5 years later, after that was thought to be the case, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, and that began the Reformation. That's what we've been talking about. So at that time, it caused, as we've had a look at, it caused great disruption in Europe, and various nations began to split apart from the Catholic system and became particularly Protestant, and sort of Europe started to divide into Protestant and Catholic nations, with a mixture of both in each of the nations, of course. What happened was, though, there was the Reformation, there was the Counter-Reformation, and the Catholic Church fought back, and indeed some of the worst atrocities and things that ever were committed after this time, as it became a battle. What we do see, though, is in the ongoing battle that it talks here about the witnesses who were assumed to be dead stood upon their feet. And I'll just read you the last part of this passage here that we got to. And it says, "And they heard a great voice from heaven, saying unto them, Come up hither. And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them." And so what this is talking about in the book of Revelation, where it talks about heaven and people ascending into heaven, or it talks about the stars in heaven, this sort of thing, it tends to be talking about the those who are in charge, those who are in rule, those who are in the political ascendancy at the time. And the thought of them ascending up to heaven in this vision here represents the Protestant nations, and basically those that were fighting against the Catholic Church were recognised politically, and they were exalted. And what happened was that some of the nations found themselves, there was great trouble happening. There was still the Turkish empires, the Ottoman Empire that was coming against Europe from the other side, and that was causing a lot of trouble. If that hadn't been happening, the Catholics may well have really gone to war against some of the Protestant nations and may have crushed the Reformation at the time. But we see that they had to hang together in Europe to be able to stand against the Ottoman Empire. So they had to make some accommodations with the Protestants, even though they didn't want to. So the end result of all of that was that they actually had to recognise them politically in places like Germany and elsewhere. And this is the point that we're talking about at this particular moment. This is in the 1500s, the early 1500s, towards the mid-1500s, and it came to the point where some of these nations had to recognise the Protestants politically, and they were able to come into power and into the governments and be represented. Their princes and their kings were represented in the councils of Europe. And so that's what it means there. They ascended up to heaven in a cloud. In other words, they were exalted politically, and their enemies beheld them, meaning that their enemies had to sit on the other side of the table, but like in a parliament where you have the two houses, the opposition on one side and the governing party on the other, and they had to tolerate each other. And so that was the situation. So that was where we left it, and we're just going to look at the last part here now. So it says there, "and the same hour." So that's the first thing to recognise, is that it was at this time where the Protestant movement was actually having to be politically recognised in Europe. that there was a great earthquake, it says, and the 10th part of the city fell. And in the earthquake were slain of men 7,000, and the remnant were affrighted and gave glory to the God of heaven. So it talks about a great earthquake, a great convulsion, and again in the book of Revelation, an earthquake signifies a great upheaval. It might be political or it might be military, and it's usually both, happening within the land, within the area. And we're quite used to the thought of earthquakes in our local scene here. And the thought was that there was a great earthquake, a great upheaval, and it overthrew a 10th part of the Catholic European Empire, so to speak. Now, the Bible talks about the 10 kingdoms and the 10 kings that were going to be basically in the Catholic European area that were going to take over after the Roman Imperial Empire in the West. And we've talked about that, the 10 nations that arose of Europe. And so it appears from this that one of those important ones was going to fall, in the sense that it was going to be lost to the Catholic European system. And it also talks about, in this great earthquake and this ongoing trouble, they would also lose 7,000. So the 7,000 there in the actual Greek, it is the word 7 chiliads. And if you have a look in the Old Testament, it talks about Israel being numbered in the thousands and the hundreds, and they sort of set men over 1,000 and men over 100 and men over 10, and they set them rulers. And over a period of time, these thousands became associated with particular tribes and particular families, and as those families grew, they sometimes numbered many more than 1,000, but they still became known under that division under the tribe. And the rulers of those thousands became noble men. They became the nobles of the land, the princes of the land, and in other words, they were the heads of the provinces. And so when you have a look in the scriptures, I've got a couple of the quotes here, which I just read to you. Under the Old Testament, it says, "But thou, Bethlehem, Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from old, from everlasting." This is a prophecy to do with Jesus Christ. So it talks about that Bethlehem would be little among the thousands of Judah, again referring to this thought of the divisions into thousands, which originally Moses made. But when this is quoted in the New Testament concerning Jesus Christ, it says, "And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel." So this word can be translated both as thousands or as a prince or a great ruler, if you like, of the province. And so it has both those meanings. The word thousand use started to become associated with the location of where the 1,000 people lived, and again, just as it did with the tribes. And in a sense, in the inheritance of the tribes in Israel, there were provinces within the tribes, and they were known as the thousands. We actually have something similar in places like Australia and England originally, that they called certain areas of land hundreds, and they're not absolutely certain why they called areas of land 100. Some people think it was because there were 100 people living there. Others think it was the fact that that particular area could supply 100 men, fighting men. And again, there were other things to do with maybe the amount of land and this sort of thing. Recently, I was over in South Australia when we were over there for a few weeks, and I happened to pick up a book on a bookshelf over there, second-hand bookshelf, book store in a market, and it was about a particular place in South Australia called Karoonda, and I had seen a little booklet extract from this book, and so I picked it up. It was quite a big book, and it was sort of basically a local history of the area. And it was of interest to me because our family was actually mentioned at my father's farm that he lived on was actually mentioned in it. The Wattchow's family was mentioned in it, all the different people in our part of the family. And they lived out in that area and owned one of the farms out there. And the areas were originally divided into what they called hundreds. And so that's a term that is used, hundreds in a county in England and also in Australia, and particularly South Australia and New South Wales. They use that term. So just in the same way, this thought here of 7,000s can refer to 7 provinces, if you like, 7 counties, 7 areas ruled over by men who were the princes and the governors of those lands. So that's a long diversion there, but as it says here, so we're looking for one of the 10 kingdoms to leave this Catholic European situation, and also in the Great Upheaval, we're looking for 7 provinces or something like that might be indicated there would also leave, and that's exactly what happened. Around about this time in the early 1500s, we see that England broke away from the papacy. And we'll have a look at the story there in a moment to do with Henry VIII. And England broke away and became Protestant. And so that was pretty much a tenth of the old Catholic European situation. And also at the same time, just after that, again in the right order here, we have there were 17 provinces of what we would call Holland today. Dutch provinces, and 7 of them actually pulled away and became Holland, and the other 10 became Belgium. And so you had the northern half, if you like, was Protestant, and the southern half was Catholic. So these two, Holland and England, they particularly pulled away from the Catholic European system and became pretty much the fortress of the Reformation. And what happened was, on the continent, apart from Holland, a lot of the early countries that went Protestant eventually sort of collapsed, and the real upholding of the truth started to fail on the continent. But England rose up and became a great bastion of the Protestant teaching and the Reformation. It gained the name the Fortress of the Reformation. So I'll just finish off that slide there. It then goes and it talks about, so it says the remnant were affrighted and gave glory to the God of heaven. And that's referring to the fact that the rest of the people in those countries, there were still Catholics within Britain, of course, and still Catholics within Holland, but they did become Protestant, generally speaking, and the Catholic that were left in those places became frightened, and they found a lot of their activities were illegal, and they were on the back foot. Then it finishes off, it says, the second woe is past, and behold, the third woe cometh quickly. And the 7th angel sounded, and there were great voices in heaven, saying, the kingdoms of this world become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. So it talks at this time, after these things happen, then it says that the second woe has come to finish, and the third woe is coming quickly or suddenly. And we talked about this a long time ago. The second woe encompasses the whole 6th trumpet. And the 6th trumpet has the 2 visions. The first vision is about the Turkish empires, which we went through in quite a number of sets of slides. And the second vision is the vision of the Reformation, which we'll be going through also in a number of sets of slides. So it covers quite a long period. But what actually happened was that the Turkish situation was still a threat at this time and continued to be a threat right up until the end of the 1600s. And so this whole situation of Britain tearing away and becoming Protestant, again, that went through a bit of a struggle for some time, but again, that came to a stable position at the end of the 1600s. And so leading into the 1700s, the second woe finishes ultimately, and the third woe then comes soon after that. And the third woe actually started around about 1789, or at least the real result of it did, and that was the French Revolution. So these things that we're looking at, they sort of lead into the whole next series, which is the 7 vials. So just to do with a bit of the history of what happened at the time, when Britain pulled away from the Catholic European system, we had this man, Henry VIII. A lot of people have heard of Henry VIII. He's fairly notorious. And he was originally, he was on the side when Martin Luther started the Reformation. This man, Henry VIII, he was Catholic, and he was very much on the side of the Pope. And he actually, in 1521, he actually wrote a long piece to dispute with Martin Luther. And it was sent to the Pope, and the Pope was very pleased to have it. It was all done in a very royal way, and a very beautiful manuscript and everything else, apparently. But he disputed with Martin Luther about the whole idea of the Reformation. So to start with, he was on the Catholic side, but he started to change his mind. And he also, particularly, what changed his mind was he had a wife. And he decided, his wife's name was Catherine, and he decided he wanted to divorce her. And of course, that wasn't allowed under the Catholic system. So ultimately, he decided to divorce himself from the Catholic system and start up the Reformation in England. So that was obviously not the best reason for doing such a thing, and his movements were political. And as we know, he sort of tended to move on from his various wives, and he beheaded quite a few of them. He got rid of them so that he could marry somebody else, again, to get around some of the rules and the laws. So as far as he was concerned, he wasn't doing it for the right reasons, but politically, this is how the whole thing started to happen. But what had been happening in Britain was that we'd had people like Tyndale and other people who had been before the Reformation starting to translate the Bible into the common tongue. And there were other people, Lollards and other people, who were, again, resisting against the Catholic faith. And these people had in a sense, prepared Britain against Catholic teachings. And so when this happened, a lot of people were ready to take up. They could see the faults in the Catholic system, and they were ready to take up the Reformation. So Henry VIII sort of triggered it off, and not necessarily for the right reasons, of course, but this is what happened in history. After Henry, there was Edward, I think it was Edward VI. I got him down there a bit later. And he particularly pushed the Reformation and started to push the country in the direction which was totally against Catholicism. And after that, we had Mary, who tried to take it back, Mary, Queen of Scots, who tried to take it back to Catholicism. And then we have Elizabeth, her cousin, who comes onto the scene, Elizabeth I, and she is a very famous queen, and she was the one who really established the Reformation and the Protestant church in Britain. Now, during her reign, during her time, the Spanish leader, Philip II, he was very much Catholic, of course, and they were the great power in the world, the great empire. And they were not very happy at all, neither was the Pope, with Queen Elizabeth. And they wanted to bring England back into the Catholic fold, into the European fold, so to speak. And so there's a whole lot of history behind all of that, but he decided to send what was called the Spanish Armada, a great fleet of ships. Again, the Spanish were very powerful. They sent a great fleet of ships to invade and to take back the throne by force with the Pope's blessing, and to change history. And there's been a number of times things like this have happened. Since this time, we have the Spanish Armada, where they tried to invade Britain. We have Napoleon later on, under the French Revolution. He also tried to invade Britain, and we had Hitler in the Second World War, who also tried to do the same thing. Great leaders and great countries, very powerful countries, who were looking to change things. Now, if any of these had succeeded, history would be very, very different. And you can read about different people who sort of put together, what if type stories. What if the Spanish Armada had succeeded? Where would we be today? Where would Britain be today? What if Napoleon had succeeded? Again, where would we be today? And these sort of things. But it didn't succeed. We'll read a few quotes here about it. So the conflict, it says, had clear religious dimensions. Relations between Catholic Spain and Protestant England had been souring for a considerable period of time, eventually leading to the outbreak of the Anglo-Spanish War in 1585. Events had been brought to a head by the English support of the Dutch Protestant United Provinces in the 80 Years' War. So, as I say, what had happened was there were 7 provinces that had pulled away in Catholic Europe, and they had formed, as it says there, the Dutch Protestant United Provinces. And during that time, both England and these provinces were supporting each other. Sometimes it was the Dutch supporting the English, and sometimes it was the English supporting the Dutch. And this happened over many decades, and the next couple of hundred years, there were things going backwards and forwards. So again, these things sort of one supporting the other brought things to a head. It says the Dutch were revolting against Spain, and to prevent further English support, Philip II of Spain planned an invasion of England. On the 29th of July 1587, he obtained papal authority to overthrow Elizabeth, who had been excommunicated by Pope Pius V, and place whomever he chose on the throne of England. So it was all about regime change, and they were going to do it by force. So an armada, the Spanish word for a battle fleet, was prepared to invade England, defeat its armies, and depose Queen Elizabeth, consisting of about 130 ships, 8,000 sailors, and 18,000 soldiers, 1,500 brass guns, and 1,000 iron guns. It was termed the Great and Most Fortunate Navy. It was also called the Invincible Armada. And it says the Spanish Empire at this time was one of the wealthiest and most powerful in the world. England was in comparison considerably weaker, both economically and militarily, and since becoming Protestant on the accession of Elizabeth, lacked powerful allies on the continent. So England was not yet the great empire that it was going to end up being, and it was really Spain that was the great power, or superpower at the time. So the Armada was subsequently defeated by the English fleet under the English admirals Lord Howard of Effingham, later Earl of Nottingham, Sir John Hawkins, and Sir Francis Drake. The Armada was unable to pick up the Spanish army waiting in the Netherlands, and was forced instead to flee northwards around the east coast of Britain, and attempted to return to Spain by sailing around the north coast of Scotland and around Ireland. Here, in addition to the usually rough seas, the ships ran into a heavy storm, sometimes described as one of the most northern hurricanes on record. Already in poor condition, after an extended period at sea, many ships were sunk or driven onto the Irish coast and wrecked. So a bit of a map there, which you might be able to see. So they sort of started off in Spain here, came up on the west side, on the east side, and eventually they sort of got past the point here where they were able to sort of turn around and go back, and they got caught in the winds and the currents, and they decided to come down the other side. But on the other side, they copped some very bad weather. They'd gotten into an area they hadn't expected to be in, and as they came around the other side, there was this great storm, and again, many of the ships were wrecked along the coasts here. And they basically, those that were left, limped back to Spain, and it was a great defeat. So the English ships were... They had, in some ways, they had more ships, but they were smaller ships, lighter ships. They were more manoeuvrable. in the winds, but they didn't have the same amount of firepower. There are all sorts of different things that sort of worked to their disadvantage and to their advantage in different things here. But at different occasions, there were various battles along the way, and the British used some fire ships or barges that they put into the middle of the Spanish ships at one point there, with the wind blowing in the right direction. I don't think any of the Spanish ships, from memory, were actually destroyed by these fire ships, but they were very much afraid of these things. They'd been used in other battles with great effect, and it basically scattered the fleet, which ended up sending them in the wrong direction, and eventually they had to go right around the coasts of Britain. So the result was a great defeat for the Spanish Armada, in spite of the fact that it had the Pope's blessing on it. And maybe because of the fact it had the Pope's blessing on it. But the end result was that it was a victory. So they had been expecting, the English had armies out on the shores, and Elizabeth was out there in her specially made armour to inspire the troops and to give a speech. And it was sort of, we will fight them on the beaches type of thing, as Churchill said later. They were expecting with this great and mighty fleet coming against them, that they could be in serious trouble. But the Lord had other ideas, and England went on to be, as I say, the fortress of the Reformation. So various medallions were struck at the time to commemorate this great battle, and some of them are quite interesting. So I don't know how well you can see some of these things, but I'll try to point out what's on them. So this particular one here, they've got inscriptions around the outside there, and some inscriptions on the inside, the dates. This one's 1588, and the inscription on the outside there says, "Thou God art great and doest wondrous things, thou art God alone." So they very much gave, whereas the Catholic nations would always give praise to Mary and the saints for all their victories, the British really gave thanks directly to God. They turned away from the Catholic ideas of worshipping Mary and the saints and idols and images, and they always gave glory to the Lord. And this one is an interesting one. This is the reverse side of that particular medallion, and I don't know if you can make it out there, but there's a bunch of men sitting around here, and they're all Catholic bishops and the Pope, and they have blindfolds on, and they have at their feet this great mat of spikes. So all their feet are on the spikes, and the inscription there reads, "It is hard to kick against the pricks." So that's what the Apostle Paul was told when the Lord saw him, and he was going against his conscience. And they were just sort of pointing out here that, for all the fact the Pope blessed all this, and the Catholics were on the side of the Spaniards, that the great Spanish Armada lost, and they were unassailed, undefeated. Another one here. This is actually the same one, but it's the inner inscription. It says, "Oh, the blind minds, the blind hearts of men." Again, that they were lost in their religion. This is another one. This one here, you can see up the top here, it's got the clouds and it's got the wind blowing upon the ships. And it has, up in the clouds, it has, in Hebrew, it has the name Jehovah. Okay, so it's God blowing with his winds upon the Spanish ships. And the inscription is, "Jehovah blew with his winds and they were scattered." So as far as they were concerned, they gave the glory to the Lord for this miraculous winning of this battle. On the reverse of that one, again, the inscription is, "I am assailed and not injured." And again, it has the clouds with the winds blowing. It has the church, the Protestant church upon the island, representing Britain there, and the waves coming against it. But in spite of the wind and the waves, it is not injured. And one more here. Again, this one shows people there praying to the Lord, This is 1588, again, the time of the Spanish Armada. And again, up the top there, we have the clouds. So you can see that. We've got the clouds and the wind blowing and people praying to the Lord. So they're just making the point there. Man's got his own ideas, but it's God who actually is in control. Man proposes and God disposes. And again, the reverse of that one has got the Spaniard ship broken in half upon the rocks and the waves, and the inscription there is, "The Spaniards fly and perish, none pursuing." So in actual fact, more ships and more sailors, the majority of the ships and the sailors that were destroyed by the storms, more than they were in all the actual firepower and the battles that they had along the way to begin with. So there were quite a few encounters there and battles, but there were more people and more ships destroyed through the storms and through the blowing of the wind. So again, it seems the Lord had his hand in it, and that's certainly how they saw it at the time. So these were the kings and the queens of the English Reformation era. So as we've pointed out, we had King Henry VIII around about the early 1500s who began things, started things off there. Edward VI, he really pushed things towards the Protestant way. And if you have a look at, I've got these different kings and queens here outlined in different colours. Those that were Protestant outlined in sort of orange, and those that were leaning towards Catholicism or trying to take England back towards Catholicism, they're outlined in purple. So Henry and Edward VI sort of led things into the Protestant rule, if you like. Then we had Mary, Queen of Scots. She tried to bring things back towards the Catholic Church, and she put about 288 people, burnt them at the stake. So that was sort of the direction that she wanted to take things back into, the Inquisition and everything else. And that probably soured a lot of people when she started to do that on the whole thought of going back under Catholicism. She didn't last very long. Her cousin Elizabeth I was the one that came in after that. And as we say, she was a very powerful queen and very powerfully pushed the country towards Protestantism. And after that, we have James I. He was the one who translated the King James Bible, again, towards Protestant things. All of these kings and queens, by the way, they had their political reasons for doing things at times, and none of them were perfect. They were, none of these people were saints. And I dare say none of them were Christians, but they... what we're looking at here is a general historical movement which is moving away from the Catholic European system towards Protestant and making it more freely available to get the Bible and to spread the Bible around and for the Word of God to go forth, which was really the Lord's hand in all that and not so much the kings and the queens. Then we go to Charles I, and he again had a lot of Catholic leanings. Maybe again tried to cover some of these things up, but he was leaning that way. And then immediately after him came in Oliver Cromwell, and again very strongly. Every time there was a Catholic leaning to go back towards Catholicism, there came in a very strong leader who pushed it back in the Protestant direction. And Oliver Cromwell did that. Then we have Charles II and James II. They started again sort of pushing things back towards Catholic religion. But after that, again, we have this very strong duo of William III and Mary II who come into the situation and take over. And again, things are finally settled that England would be a Protestant nation. So it's sort of one step forward, one step back, two steps forward, one step back. But ultimately, it was trending in the direction of the Protestant church taking hold in England. And so England became the fortress of the Reformation. And that led right up to, as I say, that sort of finalised itself around about the beginnings of the 1700s, and that really set up the European situation for the troubles that were going to erupt Not long after that, in the French Revolution, and all the troubles that led to, which led into the First and Second World Wars. So all of this is leading us up now towards the seven vials, and they are the judgments that have come to pass in the last 200 years or so, and they lead up to the second coming of Jesus Christ. So now we're getting to, in a sense, the exciting stuff, which will be more current history for us to look at, and showing us how close we are to the time. So, okay, so just a quote here. It's an interesting story behind this little book, but I won't get into that at the moment. There is the strongest reason. This is from a preface, a little book that was written about the book of Revelation. Its ideas are historicist, but they're wrong. He sort of tries to tie it all together with what's happening in his particular era. But the preface to the book is a very good one, and it's actually mentioned by a number of other books. And it says here, there is the strongest reason to believe, this is how the book begins, there is the strongest reason to believe that as Judea was chosen for the especial guardianship of the original revelation, England has been chosen for the especial guardianship of Christianity. And this started to, a lot of people in the 1800s started to realise this. They didn't have an answer for why this was, but they realised that just like the Jewish people, the people of Israel had been given the Ten Commandments, and they really were the ones that held the truth and were the guardians of the truth in the Old Testament. England seemed to be arising as the power and the empire that really was spreading the Bible and the gospel of the New Testament in the last days. And they could see this was happening. They didn't understand why it was. But this starts to tie into the other part of prophecy, which is to do with what we call the British Israel message, or the national promises. And that's the basic thought that the 10 tribes of Israel, which were scattered in Assyria, eventually migrated out through Europe and ended up in places like Britain and Holland and some of the northern Scandinavian countries, and have from there spread to the rest of the world. And so that may seem a bit of an absurd thing to say, but historians have actually traced the Saxons as coming from the old area around the Black Sea and that sort of area around Assyria, where Israel disappeared. So Israel, the 10 tribes, disappeared into this area, and at exactly the same time, from that same area, a new people, the Saxons and other people, arose from that area and moved and migrated across Europe and ended up in Britain. So it's not absurd to suggest that they were one and the same people. And if that is the case, well, all of these things start to fit together quite well. There is a reason that England has ended up being the fortress of the Reformation, because God said that the 10 tribes would be scattered, but that while they were in the wilderness, they would come back into covenant with him, not under the old covenant, but under a new covenant, and they would find the truth again in the wilderness. So I continue reading here. It says, the original revelation declared the one true God. Paganism was its corruption by substituting many false gods for the true. So under the Old Testament, the law declared that there was one true God, and that was corrupted in idolatry. The second revelation, Christianity, declared the one true mediator. Popery was its corruption by substituting many false mediators for the true. Both paganism and popery adopted the same visible sign of corruption, the worship of images. So again, under the New Testament, it was revealed that Jesus Christ was the one mediator, but the Catholic system substituted many mediators, such as the saints and Mary, and both forms of corruption ended up going into idolatry. A glance at the British history since the Reformation will show that every reign which attempted to bring back popery, or even to give it that share of power which could in any degree prejudice Protestantism, has been marked by signal calamity. It is a striking circumstance that almost every reign of this popish tendency has been followed by one purely Protestant. And as if to make the sources of the national peril and security plain to all eyes, those alternate reigns have not offered a stronger contrast in their religious principles than in their public fortunes. What he's getting at is he goes through the list just like I showed you the pictures of the various kings and queens. And if you look at the history of what was happening politically and militarily and as far as prosperity goes in the country, whenever they were under a Catholic ruler, things went drastically downhill. And whenever they went under a Protestant ruler, the country went way up. So there was a real strong contrast, and this fellow goes through, he gives some of the facts and figures behind this later in his preface. But he's pointing out that it was sort of black and white. You know, if they fell back under the wrong teaching, then everything went bad. If they came under the right teaching or, you know, held up the Bible, then everything went good. And he said, let the rank of England be what it might under the Protestant sovereign, it always went down under the Popish. And let its loss of dignity be what it might under the Popish sovereign, it always recovered under the Protestant. And more than recovered, it was distinguished by sudden success, public renovation, and increased stability in the freedom and honours of the empire. So again, just sort of showing the Lord's blessing on those that upheld the word of God. So, right back at the beginning of the scripture on the Reformation, we talked about the angel that appeared. He had a little book in his hand, and he roared out in challenge. And it says that he set his right foot upon the sea and his left foot upon the earth. And I won't go on any longer tonight, but just this thought here. It's interesting that he set his right foot, which in the scripture was the dominant one, upon the sea or the overseas area, if you like to put it that way, and his left foot upon the earth. So he was claiming ground for the Lord, but his left foot was upon the continent, so to speak, and his right foot was upon the overseas. And that suggests, you know, that while the Reformation started on the continent, that it actually came dominant out to sea in Britain, but not just in Britain, because Britain became a great empire, which then spread around the world. And we ended up with America, and we ended up with, of course, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, various other places. The empire spread right around the world. And they became Protestant nations, which spread the Bible all over the world. And at the end of this period that I talked about, as we go into the next period and we see the Catholic nations crumbling after the French Revolution, we see that's where the Empire of Britain and places like America and other places around the world began to grow and began to increase and began to particularly create the Bible societies and spread the Bible throughout the world like it had never been spread before. Again, this thought, it's strange that these nations, which had nothing to do, or it seems to most people had nothing to do with the original little country of Israel, have become the ones that are most upholding, or at least spreading out or publishing the New Testament and the message and the gospel of Christianity. And again, we know that they're doing some pretty horrible things these days. Again, it's always this case of God is working, but man is sort of fighting against it. And just like old Israel, he was always rebellious and stiff-necked. So again, we seem to be that way in our modern world as well. But we'll just leave it with that thought today. Again, the angel has indicates here that the dominant claim that the Lord was going to bring would be upon the areas overseas rather than upon the old Catholic European area. So that sets us up for the next set of slides.